Hello, I'm Kaitlyn, and this is my video on how to start your first session of D&D from a DM's perspective. Fair warning, these videos are going to be fairly unscripted, so I'll do my best, as video making is a relatively new thing to me. However, I've been a DM for now around 3 years, and I wanted to share a couple of the experiences I had in mostly kind of learning by the seat of my pants, running session to session, random one-shots whenever I felt like it, and kind of growing and adapting to what my players liked, as opposed to simply reading out of manuals or adventurers' guides on what to do. So, first up, presuming you looked at the title of the video, we're going to cover how to start your first session. Starting your first session is generally kind of a daunting task, and for a lot of DMs, sometimes the game never actually gets there. You have this concept of making characters and a fantastical world. You've got all these ideas which may or may not be better suited for a book, and you're just really excited to play with your friends. But getting the group together kind of falls through, you don't manage to prepare in time, and everything just kind of becomes this massive weight because being the DM, you are the central pillar of the campaign and the person who ultimately gets everything started. So, in an attempt to alleviate that somewhat, I'm going to go over a couple of simple things that make a interesting and simple first session adventure. When you start your first session, you might be convinced that you need to have this grand narrative moment where the castle is sieged and an army invades, or everybody's on a ship but the ship starts to sink, or some big bad evil guy or ultra extra dimensional god appears and invokes its wrath. Something crazy that you think is going to really hype up players. And yes, that can be helpful, but by no means is it required. Honestly, the most important part of starting a session one is the introduction of your players. Lots of people complain at times that a party can feel stilted, or roleplay is slow, or they just don't really know how to get into the game. And the first session is really important for this, at least in my opinion. Traditionally, I try and make settings or entrances which aren't stellar. They're not this amazing brand new idea, but that's for a reason. You don't actually need to have some super unique opening moment. You can if you feel up to it, but by all means, just having a tavern, like I'm showing before you, and introducing your players slowly can work fine. When I started this one shot, which is what I'm showing you currently, I made this huge map with a kind of free cut by section area. Up here was intended for kind of in the streets combat. Down here was a marketplace, and this central area was a kind of hidden in the alleys tavern area in the poorer district of town. I created a map which was for the entire broader city with varying different names and sections of it. And I created a start page which kind of gave like a setting opener and a general feel of what the environment they were going to would look like. And I believe, if memory serves, this is just Dark Souls 3, I think, or something akin to that, but don't quote me on that. So, returning to introductions, the most important thing is to create a setting which you can very easily throw your players into immediately. You want to introduce them slowly and preferably either have a situation where they can openly describe themselves in the surroundings or introduce a singular NPC that your characters can bounce off of when they first arrive. Slow introductions, one at a time, or in smaller groups, and encouraging players to describe their character and kind of initially start that roleplay really helps. When I began this one shot, I believe I had around 5 players, if memory serves at least. And I started off by bringing in a character that I was fairly sure the player would be confident. I had them wander in on their own. They kind of sat down, did the whole wander into the bar, I order a drink, I talk to the tavern keep, I let them set themselves up. Then I brought in a quieter player, had them introduce themselves. They bounced off of the new character that was there, and we kind of kept going from there, one by one, allowing players to filter in and giving them maybe 5 minutes at a time to introduce themselves, roleplay a little bit, and start to form a bond. Because at the end of the day, whilst your role as the DM is to facilitate the game, to push it forward, and to, create moments that do lead to roleplay, ultimately, the actual role playing is going to be on the part of your players more so than you. You will play many myriad characters, villains, and monsters, but if the party themselves aren't comfortable together, in character and out of character, then you're kind of already screwed at the very beginning. Another thing about your first session is don't feel like you have to have some massive opening. I mentioned before, like, having an amazing narrative moment, and that's fine. You could have that, but if we think about other kind of fantastical moments and openings to books and movies, like say Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings starts off small. You're in a small, cozy village. Frodo finds the ring. He's on the path to kind of figure out what to do with it. And the ring wraiths run across the path, and it's a terrifying moment of this villainy from a very different world coming into a smaller space. And I do think that when you're creating a game, you shouldn't obsess with the wider world. Start small, whether that be a couple of streets or a small town, a battlefield, a city, and not really worrying about the outer world. Sure, create landmarks, make continents or a country or perhaps some outward layers of the world that you can draw on in the roleplay, but don't obsessively create 5 different maps, um, kind of a whole political system and the warring kingdoms around. You can do that, and if that's something you really enjoy, go ahead. But a lot of D&D campaigns kind of get mired down in the world building before they really get anywhere. So my general advice would be if you really just want to start a campaign, just kind of make a opening area. I generally advise going as far as just creating a town and maybe what you feel comfortable in regards to a single quest or encounter that you can fall back on, and then leave it there and roleplay the session out. You can end by the time you reach the end of your prepared content, but it kind of stops those moments of, oh, I've made like an entire country and, my 5 players didn't turn up, or we only ran one session and nothing really came of it. Um, Moving on, it's important that you as the DM keep things a little bit bounded and small. And the reason I'm saying that you should keep these things smaller is because, in my opinion, my first sessions of campaigns, while I do bring in a bit of the narrative and start to let players kind of wander, really, the first session is about players. If your players get into a situation where they're openly role playing, then don't stop them. As a DM, honestly, this is the point where you can kind of sit back and enjoy what you've done. The players will be usually interacting a little bit with their world, um, bouncing off the things that you've created, or sharing some of their backstory. And this is a good time for you to one, relax, or two, prepare where you want things to go ahead from here. If everybody's busy talking in the tavern, then you can be preparing the NPC, the corrupt policeman who's going to burst in and maybe cause a scene, the drunkard who's just going to spill their drink over one of the players, or some kind of encounter outside where perhaps several rogues are trying to mug a man and that's going to draw the eyes of the player and start their first encounter. When players are role playing, this is honestly the best sign that you've kind of set things up in a way that they're comfortable. So never feel like just because they're not interacting with the thing that I've put down and instead of talking to each other that you aren't running a good game. Generally speaking, more roleplay is never bad. But moving along from roleplay, there is always the moment where your players are going to do something that you don't expect. And no matter how much experience you have, it happens to everyone. I'd argue that we regularly see that happen on Critical Role with Matt Mercer and many other experienced DMs. You just kind of have to learn to roll with it. Um, Looking back at my city map, I made so many different points of the map that players could have gone to, and they could have really just thrown me out there for a loop. So what I did was create several different little map areas. Some of them are gone now because obviously I've ran through this one shot, but I created secondary maps which I was comfortable running mini encounters or kind of flicking out in front of them almost as a distraction or something that they could run into. It wasn't super prepared, but it gives the illusion that you know what you're doing, which honestly is half of DMing. You're going to be taken by surprise. You're going to be in a situation where your players do something that really throws you out of it, and you just need to whisk on the next set piece and go, ah, I totally expected this. Let's keep going. In this scenario, I, for the one shot, prepared an encounter which was in the sewers, following this kind of hulking werewolf-like creature. And the good thing about sewers in a city is you could go into the sewers anywhere in the city. It doesn't matter what district they're in. A city needs a sewer level. So all they needed to do is draw whatever they were doing to the sewer encounter through some decent narration, or, they wander down an alley and they hear this growling, scratching noise, and they go to pursue it, and there are bloody trails on the floor that lead to this grate. Something like that, which will always bring them down to the sewer level. It's a way of preparing a blank map or a vista map, like the opening, that you can easily use just to draw roleplay on and to draw their eyes to, but you want to make it just kind of blank enough that you can slot it into a scene at any time. I want to go back and reiterate, however, that you shouldn't feel like you need to over prepare for a first session. Sure, it helps, and I won't deny that in my first campaign, I super over prepared. My first campaign, I drew a little bit from Oblivion. I had a prison opening with a series of encounters. The players kind of went from combat to combat, had their moments to talk to each other. There was like opening scenery of the prison being attacked and they were trying to get out. They didn't know who the attackers were. They didn't know what was going on with the prison guards. There was a whole kind of scene of, well, the prison seems very corrupt and they're kind of imprisoning people for um, things that are very much not um, in line with what they would need to be to get here, like loitering in the streets. Oh well, off to the island prison with you. Things that just don't really make sense and prompt a little bit of investigation. But the players didn't look into all of these things at once because I had over prepared. I had got too much kind of going at once, which ultimately made it so that I had a lot to work with in later sessions. but it did mean that I kind of ended up not really using a lot of the information that I brought about for them in the first session. What I want to say is preparing entire encounters, multiple encounters back to back, making 4 different layered maps and all this kind of stuff. It's useful and it always gives you a fallback, but don't think that you need to do all of this just to run your first session. Honestly, one of the main things about DMing is learning to kind of just wing it. By no means do all DMs just make things up and fly by the seat of their pants. But I'm not going to lie and say that as I learned to DM more, that was something I did end up doing a lot. And as a new DM, you'll probably have to learn to do too. Keeping to a over-prepared or tight schedule of things that players need to do can kind of be limiting to player agency. Now, this isn't to say that you need to have an open world where you kind of lean back and just say, players do what you want, because some players won't work with that. I've tried running games like that, and it kind of depends on the session. Sometimes my players are really good with open-ended, do what you want scenarios, but sometimes you end up with that situation of too much choice, like looking at your Steam library with 50 games and thinking, I just don't have anything to play. The same thing kind of happens in D&D. If you throw your players into a city that they don't really know or have any draws upon, they're gonna kind of just end up coming back to you, the DM, and say, uh, is there a tavern nearby that I could go to? Or is there a shop? Or a quest board? You still need to provide some direction, but don't feel like you always need to railroad them. DMing and running the game is very much about what the DM provides and what the players are interested in. These two things are the most important part of your first session. You can prepare an entire massive world, but ultimately, the players might just be more interested in what Bob the shopkeep has to say today. Sometimes you just gotta live with that. Finally, I just kind of want to end on just have fun. As simple as it is to say that. As a DM, you're here to have fun with your friends, or at least the people that you've gathered with. If you're not yet friends, you're probably going to be if you plan on running a long form campaign. And what I want you to do in going into these campaigns is don't feel like you have to go through backbreaking work to make everything happy for your players. The game is a game for a reason, and you need to have fun with it. If you go into every session filled with anxiety about how you're not going to have fun and um, dreading this player's reaction or dreading having to run this encounter, then maybe you need to discuss something with your players or perhaps lighten the workload rather, that you're providing for yourself. Ultimately, with your first session, my last tip would be just end the session when you're comfortable with ending it. If that's 2 hours in, 4 hours in, or 8 hours in, because you've really had a big session of roleplay and you just can't help continuing, then that's fine. End when you are comfortable with. A big part of DMing is that you are the de facto organizer of the group. You need to learn to be curt and to keep things on track, but also let people have fun, let people joke, but don't let them completely run off with your campaign, squander your sessions, or waste time. But yeah, that's the end of my thoughts on this first video about running a session 1. I hope that you like this kind of unscripted style of video making. This is the first time I've made videos on D&D. It's a subject I'm really passionate about, so I'm hoping that people like this. But, let me know in the comments if you think there's something that I missed out, then please let me know and I'll try and discuss it in a future video. I will link below in the description the tools I use to make these maps that I've kind of just been leaving on the screen while I talked. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and if you want to support me, then please give the video a like or share it with people. Or there's my Patreon, which will be down in the description. Give it a look. I create D&D items and in the future classes and adventures. But any of the income I get from the Patreon also goes into the videos that I plan on making in the future. That's me. I've been Kaitlyn, and thank you for watching. Bye.